Hello and welcome. Tonight, our journey into the unexplained leads us to a time of profound misery and superstition. We investigate a plague that did not attack the body with sores or fever, but attacked the mind, seizing control of the limbs and forcing its victims into a macabre and deadly marathon. This is not a ghost story, but the terrifyingly real account of a city that was consumed by a dance of death. This is the definitive deep dive into the dancing plague of 1518. To understand the madness that befell the city of Strasbourg in 1518, one must first understand the world of desperation in which its citizens lived. Strasbourg, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire, was a city teetering on the edge of collapse. The year had been cruel. A brutal winter had given way to a late frost, which in turn was followed by hailstorms and drought. The crops had failed catastrophically. The price of bread, the staple food for the poor, skyrocketed. Famine stalked the city, and with it came its companions, disease and death. Smallpox, syphilis, and leprosy were rampant. Orphanages and poorhouses overflowed. The common person was trapped in a state of chronic, unrelenting stress, living each day with the gnawing fear of starvation and the specter of a painful death. This was a deeply religious and superstitious society that saw every misfortune as a sign of God's wrath or a demonic curse. The psychological tinder was dry, waiting for a single bizarre spark to set it ablaze. That spark came in the oppressive heat of mid-July. A woman known to history only as Frau Troffea emerged from her home onto one of the city's narrow cobblestone streets, and she began to dance. There was no music, there was no celebration. Her movements were jerky, convulsive. She danced with a silent, grim determination, her face a mask of what appeared to be not joy but a tormented agony. Her husband pleaded with her to stop, but she seemed not to hear him. Her body was a puppet, its strings pulled by an unseen master. She danced through the day and into the night, collapsing from exhaustion for brief, fitful moments of sleep, only to rise again and continue her frantic, pointless jig. For the first few days, she was a local curiosity, a mad woman providing a grim spectacle for her neighbors. But her strange affliction was not contained. After about a week of this solo performance, the madness began to spread. First, a few onlookers who had been watching her began to twitch and jerk. Then they too were seized by the same irresistible compulsion. They joined Frau Troffea in her silent, agonizing dance. The contagion was not viral, it was psychological. Within a week, over 30 people were dancing in the streets. The city's elite, the magistrates and physicians of the guilds, were baffled and alarmed. They consulted the medical wisdom of the day, which was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. They concluded that the dancers were suffering from, quote, hot blood, a natural affliction caused by an overheated brain. Their prescribed cure, however, would prove to be catastrophic. They believed that the only way to cure the affliction was to let it run its course. The victims needed to dance the fever out of their systems. They needed more dancing. Following this fatal diagnosis, the city authorities took a series of bizarre steps. They cleared out the public grain market and the horse fair to create two large, open-air dance floors. They went a step further, constructing a large wooden stage in the square next to the city's magnificent cathedral. To encourage the dancing, and they hoped speed up the cure, they even hired professional musicians. Drummers and pipers were brought in to provide a constant rhythmic soundtrack for the unfolding nightmare. This decision turned a strange local phenomenon into a full-blown, state-sponsored epidemic of madness. The scene in Strasbourg became something out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting, a vision of hell on earth. Hundreds of people now filled the streets and the specially constructed stage, writhing and convulsing to the relentless beat of the drums. This was not a festival. The dancers' faces were contorted in pain. They screamed for mercy, begged for help, but their limbs refused to obey. They were prisoners in their own bodies. They danced under the blazing summer sun, their clothes soaked with sweat, their feet shredded and bleeding on the rough wooden planks and cobblestones. They were dancing themselves to death. The death toll began to climb. People, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, began to collapse and die from strokes, heart attacks, and sheer, absolute exhaustion. The chronicles of the time report as many as 15 deaths per day at the height of the plague. The musicians, presumably horrified, were ordered to keep playing. The healthy citizens watched on, terrified that they too would be swept up in the terrifying, deadly mania. The city's cure had become a public execution. After several weeks of this horrifying spectacle, with the death toll rising and no end in sight, the panicked city council finally realized their catastrophic error. They abandoned the medical explanation and embraced a supernatural one. The music was stopped, the stage torn down. The dancing was now declared a curse, a divine punishment from an angry Saint Vitus. In the Catholic tradition, Saint Vitus was the patron saint one prayed to for protection against epilepsy and neurological disorders, but he was also believed to be capable of inflicting a dancing plague upon sinners.
In the hills outside the city. There, they were made to pray before his wooden effigy. Small crosses were placed in their hands. Whether it was the power of belief, the change of scenery, or simply the fact that the mania had finally exhausted itself, the pilgrimage seemed to work. In the quiet solitude of the shrine, away from the frenzied atmosphere of the city, the last of the dancers slowly stopped their convulsive movements. By early September, the dancing plague of 1518 was over. The streets of Strasbourg fell silent, leaving behind a traumatized populace and one of the most bizarre and terrifying mysteries in medical history. So, what caused hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? For centuries, the question has baffled historians and scientists. The supernatural explanation, that of a saint's curse, was the belief at the time, but it offers little for a modern understanding. A leading scientific theory for many years pointed to a physical cause: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a mold that grows on damp rye, the staple grain used to make bread in the region. This fungus produces alkaloids that are chemically similar to LSD. Ingesting ergot-tainted bread can cause a condition called ergotism, which has two forms. One causes gangrene, and the other, the convulsive form, causes painful muscle spasms, seizures, and vivid hallucinations. On the surface, this seems like a perfect explanation. A whole city eating tainted bread could certainly lead to a mass outbreak of bizarre neurological symptoms. However, modern experts have largely cast doubt on this theory. While ergot causes spasms, it is unlikely to produce the coordinated day-long dancing that was described. Furthermore, the convulsive effects of ergotism are not typically a group activity. People would be writhing on the ground, not dancing in a crowd. Finally, ergotism is highly toxic and often lethal in much smaller doses. It's unlikely that hundreds of people could have danced for weeks while suffering from its effects. This leads to the most widely accepted modern explanation, which is perhaps the most unsettling of all: mass psychogenic illness, more commonly known as mass hysteria. This is a phenomenon where a group of people, under conditions of extreme and prolonged stress, begin to exhibit a set of physical symptoms for which there is no corresponding physical cause. It is, in essence, a psychological illness that manifests physically and spreads through a population via social contagion. The citizens of Strasbourg in 1518 were the perfect candidates for such an outbreak. They were living in a crucible of fear and desperation. The stress of famine, rampant disease, and crippling poverty had pushed them to the absolute breaking point. Their minds were fertile ground for a psychological contagion. In their deeply superstitious worldview, the belief in curses and demonic possession was not a metaphor. It was a reality.
Meta, pause, Sexo 5 at work. Their culture already contained the idea of a dancing plague as a form of divine punishment. In this context, Frau Troffea's initial desperate dance acted as the trigger. In a psychologically primed population, the sight of her strange affliction was enough to cause a chain reaction. Others, seeing her, unconsciously adopted the same symptoms as an outlet for their own unbearable stress. They fell into a trance-like dissociative state where the conscious mind was no longer in control of the body. The decision by the authorities to encourage the dancing, with music and a public stage, was like throwing gasoline on a fire, validating the mania and amplifying the social contagion until it consumed the entire city. The dancing plague of 1518 was likely not caused by a single factor, but by a perfect storm. The misery of the populace was the tinder, their superstitious beliefs were the fuel, and a single woman's public breakdown was the spark that ignited a city-wide conflagration of madness. The story is a terrifying testament to the power of the human mind to break from reality under unbearable pressure. It's a chilling reminder that the most horrifying plagues are not always the ones that attack our bodies, but the ones that attack our minds, turning our own limbs into instruments of our destruction.